Most people who pass a cemetery on a Sunday morning make the same decision without knowing they're making it. They look away, not from cruelty, from courtesy. A cemetery is a private place. The grief that happens there belongs to the people inside it, and the decent thing is to give it room. If they see an old man at a grave, they understand that what is happening is not for them. They feel something, a passing heaviness, a brief awareness of their own mortality, and then the road goes on and the moment recedes. And that is what happens. They see a closed circle. They see a private thing. They see something that is finished or close to it, and they look away. A biker named Joe Carver did not look away. He did not look away because he had looked away once before, at a grave not very different from this one, on a Sunday morning not very different from this one, and he had told himself it was courtesy and had known, driving home, that it was not. He had been carrying that knowledge for 8 months, and when he slowed on the county road outside Millfield, Kentucky, and saw through the iron gate of Millfield Cemetery an old man sitting alone in a folding chair with a thermos in his lap and 2 cups on the grave marker in front of him, Joe Carver pulled over and stopped and sat for a moment. Then he got off the bike. He went in. He had no plan. He had no idea yet that the old man had been coming here every Sunday for 11 years. He did not know about the thermos or the 2 cups or what the 2 cups meant. He had not heard of Arthur Kemp or Vivian Kemp or the 62 years they had been married or the Sunday morning in October when the doctor had used the words, "I'm afraid," and the world had become a different shape than it had been before those words. He knew one thing. An old man was sitting alone at a grave on a Sunday morning, and something about the quality of that aloneness was not the kind that should be left entirely to itself. He went in. Millfield, Kentucky was the kind of town that used to be more than it was, the kind where you could see the outline of the larger thing it had been, in the width of the main street, designed for traffic it no longer had, in the storefronts that had been something specific once and were now a consignment shop and a vape store, and 2 empty windows with paper taped to the inside. The hardware store was still the hardware store, which counted for something. The diner was still the diner. The churches were still the churches. The cemetery sat on the north edge of town, behind the Baptist church, with iron gates that were open from dawn to dusk and a gravel path that split at the old oak in the center and went in 3 directions from there. The older section had stones going back to the 1880s, some of them tilted by time, the inscriptions worn to guesses. The newer section, added in 1991, had level ground and the particular regularity of a place that was still filling in. Vivian Ann Kemp was in the newer section, row 4, 3rd stone from the path. Her stone said her name and her years, 1938 to 2013, and below that, at Arthur's instruction, 4 words. She made everything warmer. Arthur had chosen those 4 words because they were true, and because everything else he could think of was too small for her and too large for a stone, and he had decided that true and simple was better than trying to find the words that didn't exist. He had stood in the monument shop in Harlan and said those 4 words to the man behind the counter, and the man had written them down without comment, and Arthur had gone home and sat in the kitchen and drunk his coffee alone for the first time in 62 years. Before we get to what Arthur Kemp said when Joe Carver sat down in the grass beside him, and before we get to why a man with a thermos and 2 cups had been coming to the same grave every Sunday for 11 years, subscribe if you're new here and drop your city in the comments. I read every one because what Arthur told Joe that morning and what Joe did with it is one of the quietest and largest things in any story I've told. Stay with me. His name was Arthur James Kemp, and he was 84 years old, and he had grown up in Millfield and gone to Korea at 19 and come back at 21 and never left again, which was not a failure of imagination, but a choice, the considered repeated choice of a man who knew where he belonged and had belonged there. He had taught history and civics at Millfield High School for 38 years. He had coached the debate team for 22 of those years and had produced 3 state champions and 1 young man who had gone on to serve in the state legislature and still called Arthur on his birthday, which Arthur received with the specific pleasure of a teacher who has learned not to expect to see the thing he planted grow and is grateful every time he does. He had married Vivian Marsh in 1961, 2 years after she came to Millfield to teach English at the same school. And they had been colleagues before they were lovers and friends before both of those things. And the 62 years they had been married had the quality of a thing that had been built slowly and maintained carefully and was still standing, solid to its foundations, on the morning it ended. He was not a man who fell apart. He had learned something in Korea about what falling apart costs and what it is worth, and he had come home from that war and lived the rest of his life with a specific and practiced attention to the things that mattered. He had buried his parents. He had buried two of his three brothers. He had said goodbye at bedsides and gravesides with the particular composure of a man who has made a study of loss and knows that it does not reduce by being made large. He had not been composed the morning Vivian died. He had been sitting beside her bed in the room at the end of the second-floor corridor when she went, holding her hand the way he had been holding her hand for 3 days. And when the quality of the room changed and the nurse came in and said what the nurse said, he had kept holding her hand for a long time after, because it was the last thing he could do and he was in no hurry to stop doing it. He had come home to a house that still smelled of her. He had made coffee, because they had always made coffee on Sunday mornings, and it was Sunday, and he had sat at the kitchen table and poured 2 cups, the way he always poured. 2 cups, and then he had looked at the second cup for a long time. That was the first Sunday. By the third Sunday, he had started going to the cemetery instead, because the house was too full of her in a way that he could not get used to, and the grave was full of her in a way that he could, or was at least trying to. He brought the thermos because they had always had coffee on Sunday mornings. He brought 2 cups because he had been bringing 2 cups for 62 years, and he was not going to stop on account of logistics. He sat in his folding chair, and he drank his coffee, and he talked to her, or he didn't, depending on the Sunday. Sometimes he told her about the week. Sometimes he sat in silence because they had also been good at silence, and he did not want to pretend they hadn't been. He had been doing this for 11 years. His daughter, Catherine, lived in Nashville and called every Sunday evening. His son, Thomas, lived in Portland and called less often and felt worse about it than he needed to. He had 3 grandchildren he saw at Thanksgiving and 1 great-grandchild he had met twice. They were good people who lived their lives at a distance that was not negligence, but geography, and he understood it and did not blame them, and was alone every Sunday morning at the cemetery regardless. His friends, the friends from the school, from the years, from the long middle of a life in one place, had been dying one by one since he turned 70, and each one left a smaller world, and the world now was quite small. He knew the woman at the pharmacy and the man at the hardware store, and Pastor Willis at the Baptist church, and he had his garden, and he had his Sundays with Vivian, and it was enough to manage on. He had decided, without saying it to anyone, that it was enough to manage on. Joe Carver was 43 years old, and he had been riding for 21 years, and his mother had died 8 months ago in a room at the Millfield Regional Medical Center, and he had been the only person in the room. Not because her life had been small. She had been loved, had friends, had raised Joe and his brother well, but his brother lived in Seattle, and the friends were old, and it had been a Tuesday afternoon in February, and the end had come faster than anyone expected, and Joe had been holding her hand when it happened, and there had been no one else there. He had thought about that a great deal in the 8 months since, about what it meant to be the only witness to a life's ending, about the drives he had taken on Sunday mornings when the house felt too close, and the cemeteries he had passed, and the people he had seen through iron gates, and the times he had looked away because it was the courteous thing. He had not gone in any of those times. He had gone in today. He walked across the grass of the newer section, and he found the man in a folding chair in row 4, and he stopped a respectful distance away, the way you stop when you are not sure if you are welcome. And the man looked up at him. Arthur Kemp looked at the motorcycle jacket and the patches and the man wearing them, and he said, "I'm not in any difficulty." Joe said, "I know. I saw you from the road." Arthur said, "People generally don't stop." Joe said, "I know." Arthur looked at him for a moment. He looked at the thermos in his own lap, and the 2 cups on the stone, and the folding chair he had brought from his car, and the grave of Vivian Ann Kemp, who had made everything warmer. He said, "You've lost someone recently." Joe said, "My mother, 8 months ago." Arthur nodded. He said, "The first year is the year of firsts. First Christmas, first birthday, first Sunday in February." Joe said, "Yes." Arthur said, "It gets different. Not smaller, different." Joe said, "That's what people say." Arthur said, "It's what I know." He looked at the stone. I've been coming here for 11 years. It has gotten different. Joe stood in the November grass and looked at the stone and the two cups. He said, "Every Sunday?" Arthur said. "Alone." Arthur looked at him. He said, "Yes," and the word had weight in it. Not complaint, not self-pity, something more like the specific gravity of a fact that has been carried a long time. Joe said, "Can I sit down?" Arthur looked at him for a moment. Then he said, "Suit yourself." Joe sat down in the grass. He did not say anything. They sat in the November morning with the old oak visible over the graves and the iron gate behind them, and the sound of Millfield going about its Sunday on the other side of the cemetery wall. And they were quiet for a while in the way of two people who have each recently had a Sunday that was too quiet in the wrong direction. After a time, Arthur said, "She taught English. She could find the exact right word for anything, and I could never write a thing on my own." Joe said, "What did she do when you couldn't find the word?" She said, "The word always comes if you give it time." He looked at the stone. She was right about most things. Joe said, "Vivian." He said it the way people say the names of the dead they love, quietly, with the full weight of the name behind it, the whole person in 2 syllables. Joe stayed another hour. He came back the following Sunday. Arthur was already in his folding chair when Joe arrived, the thermos in his lap, the 2 cups on the stone. Joe sat down in the grass again. They talked more this time. Arthur told him about the debate team, about the state champion in 1987, who was now a state legislator and still called on birthdays. Joe told him about his mother, a woman named Helen who had taught herself to play guitar at 68 and had never been very good at it, and had played it for the last 12 years of her life with a cheerfulness that had nothing to do with ability. Arthur said, "That's a woman with the right idea." Joe said, "She had a lot of right ideas." They sat with that for a while. The third Sunday, Joe brought his own thermos. Arthur looked at it. Joe said, "I figured I'd bring my own." Arthur looked at him for a moment. Something in his face shifted, not toward amusement, toward the place adjacent to it, the same place that is adjacent to being moved. He said Vivian would have said that was the right decision. Joe said, "She sounds like she was right about most things." Arthur said, "I mentioned that." Yes. On the 4th Sunday, Joe made 9 calls before he drove to the cemetery. He had been thinking about it since the 2nd Sunday, and he had been waiting until he was certain it was the right thing, and on the 4th Sunday morning he was certain. He called chapter members he trusted to understand what he was asking and why, and he told them about Arthur and the 11 years and the 2 cups, and the specific weight in the word alone. He told them he was not asking them to do anything except show up and sit down. He said, "This is not a confrontation, and it is not a rescue. It is just an old man who has been at a grave alone for 11 years on Sunday mornings, and I think we should go be with him." Every person he called said yes. Every person he called other people. Arthur Kemp arrived at Millfield Cemetery on the 5th Sunday at 8:15 in the morning, as he always arrived, with his folding chair under his arm and his thermos in his hand, and he stopped at the iron gate. The road outside the cemetery was lined with motorcycles on both sides as far as he could see in each direction. He stood at the gate, and he looked at the road, and he counted to approximately 30 before he stopped counting, which was not close to the total, which was 522. Joe was standing just inside the gate. Arthur looked at him. Joe said, "Good morning." Arthur said, "There are a great many motorcycles on my road." Joe said, "Yes." Arthur looked at the road, and then at the road again. He said, "This is about the Sundays." Joe said, "Yes." Arthur was quiet for a moment. He looked at his thermos. He looked at the folding chair under his arm. He had the expression of a man who has decided at some point in the last 11 years that the world was no longer going to surprise him and is revising that decision. He said, "How many?" Joe said, 522. Arthur said, "That's a great many people to come to a cemetery on a Sunday morning." Joe said, "For me." Joe said, "For you." A long silence. The November morning was cold and clear, the sky the particular blue of late autumn, the trees at their last color. The road held 522 motorcycles, and the people who had ridden them, from 4 counties and 2 states, some of them having ridden since before dawn, all of them having come because Joe had called 9 people, and said an old man has been sitting alone at his wife's grave for 11 years, and I think we should go be with him, and every person who heard it had said yes. Arthur Kemp looked at all of it for a long moment. He said, I have a folding chair and a thermos. Joe said, I know. Arthur said, I only brought 2 cups. Joe said, we brought our own. Arthur looked at him. He said, you're going to sit in the grass. Joe said, if that's all right with you. Another silence. Arthur said, Vivian would have. He looked at the gate and the road and the 522 people, and he pressed his lips together for a moment and did not say what Vivian would have said, because what Vivian would have said was between him and Vivian. She would have had something to say about this. Joe said, what would she have said? Arthur looked at the grave through the trees, row 4, third from the path. He said, she would have said it was about time. 522 people followed Arthur Kemp through the iron gate of Millfield Cemetery on a Sunday morning in November. They were quiet when they came. No engines. They had left the bikes at the road, just the sound of boots on gravel and grass, and the November wind in the old oak. They came through the gate in 1s and 2s, and they followed the gravel path and split where it split, and they found row 4 and the rows around it, and the paths between, and they filled the newer section of Millfield Cemetery with the careful attention of people who know they are in someone else's space and are being deliberate about how they occupy it. Arthur set his folding chair where he always set it. He sat down. He poured his coffee from the thermos. He set the second cup on the stone the way he always set it, because that was why he brought 2 cups, and he was not going to change it on account of an audience. 522 people sat down in the grass around him. Not all at once. Gradually, the way people lower themselves when they are choosing to be somewhere rather than passing through it. They sat on the grass of the newer section and the gravel of the path and the verge of the older section, and they were quiet. Some of them had thermoses. Some had coffee in paper cups from the gas station on Route 9. They drank their coffee, and they were quiet, and the November morning was cold and clear, and the old oak moved in the wind, and the stones of Millfield Cemetery stood in their rows, and the sound of the town on the other side of the wall was the sound of Sunday going about itself. Arthur drank his coffee. He did not speak for a while, and no one required him to. After a time, he said to no one in particular, and to all of them, her name was Vivian. She taught English for 31 years. She said the word always comes if you give it time. He paused. She made everything warmer. He said it the way it was written on the stone, simply because it was true and because everything else was too small or too large. 522 people sat in the grass and listened. The old oak moved. The November light came in from the east and lay across the rows. Joe drove Arthur home at noon. Arthur had not asked for this. Joe had offered, and Arthur had looked at him for a moment and said, all right, and they had packed the folding chair and the thermos into Joe's truck, which was large enough, and driven the 6 blocks to Arthur's house on Elm Street in a companionable quiet that did not require filling. At the door, Arthur said, you'll come next Sunday. Joe said, yes. Arthur said, just you. Joe said, the others, if they want to come again, on a different Sunday. They're welcome. He paused. But not every Sunday. Some Sundays are for the 2 of us. Joe said, I'll tell them. Arthur nodded. He looked at the truck and at Joe and at the middle distance in the specific way of a man revising an assumption he had carried a long time. He said, I told myself after a while that I preferred it quiet, the Sundays. He looked at the door. I think I was managing. Joe said, I know. Arthur said, it is better, with someone there. Joe sat in the truck for a moment before he started it. He thought about the 522 people sitting in the grass. He thought about the second cup on the stone. He thought about Helen, with her guitar, not very good at it, cheerful about it anyway, playing for 12 years because she had the right idea, and the right idea was to keep playing regardless. He thought about Arthur, saying she said the word always comes if you give it time, about a woman who had spent 31 years teaching people to wait for the right word, and about the 4 words on the stone that had been waiting 62 years to be the right ones. She made everything warmer. He started the truck. He drove home through Millfield on a Sunday in November, and the town went about its Sunday the way it always did. And the cemetery was behind him on the north edge of town. And in the newer section, row 4, third stone from the path, a second cup of coffee sat on a grave marker as it had sat every Sunday for 11 years. And for the first time in 11 years, the grass around it held the impression of 522 people who had come on a Sunday morning to sit with a man who had been told, by the word itself, that he was no longer alone. There is a kind of faithfulness that the world does not see, because it happens quietly every week in a place no one passes through on purpose. A man with a thermos and 2 cups, 11 years of Sundays, a love so complete that it did not require an audience and did not diminish without one. It just needed, once, for someone to stop looking away. If this story reached you, if you know someone who has been keeping faith with someone who is gone, alone, without witness, share it tonight with someone who needs to know that the world can still stop and sit down. Subscribe so you never miss the next one. Drop your city in the comments. And if you have someone you still bring 2 cups for, or if you know someone who does, type 2 cups in the comments. I read every single one.